Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in warmly welcoming our Center Director, Dr. Maha Leia B. Ravado.
Good afternoon, everyone. Magandang hapon sa ating lahat. First, may I acknowledge Honorable Jude Asidre on his way, right? Okay, representative of Tingog Party List and co-chairperson of EDCOM 2. Of course, our host, University of the Philippines President, Attorney Angelo Jimenez, Dr. Carol Marquis, Executive Director of EDCOM 2, Dr. Lorraine P. Pesimaco, Vice President for Academic Affairs of the University of the Philippines. We also acknowledge our distinguished panel speakers, Dr. Marie Therese Angeline Bustos, Professor of the College of Education, UP Diliman, Dr. Akihiro Fushimi, Education Chief of UNICEF Philippines, Dr. Martin Hayden, Professor Emeritus of Southern Cross University, Australia, and of course, Dr. Dina Ocampo, Professor, UP Diliman College of Education. To our educators, policymakers, researchers, development partners, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, again, good afternoon. On behalf of SEAMEO INNOTECH, welcome to this seminar series organized in partnership with the University of the Philippines Center for Education and Development, or UP CEDEV. Guided by our commitment to driving innovation for education, we are pleased to convene this regional forum on education and learning on the theme Education for Development, Conversations on the EDCOM 2 Reports. Today's forum begins with a concern that is urgent for the Philippines, the continuing challenge of ensuring that education truly supports development. Current data points to a serious learning crisis in the Philippines. Only 30.52% of grade 3 learners are proficient in literacy and numeracy, declining sharply to only 0.40% by grade 12. These outcomes are linked to persistent resource gaps, particularly in rural schools, including overcrowded classrooms and limited access to ICT. At the same time, teachers continue to face specialization mismatch and limited access to in-service training. This is why the theme, Education for Development, is both timely and necessary. It asks us to examine whether our education system is equipping learners with the knowledge, values, skills, and agency they need to participate meaningfully in society and contribute to sustainable economic development. When learners do not acquire foundational competencies, development is constrained. When teachers are unsupported, reform cannot take root. When systems remain fragmented or under-resourced, inclusive growth becomes harder to achieve. While the EDCOM 2 reports focus on the Philippine context, the issues they raise resonate across Southeast Asia. We have audience online from other countries beyond the Philippines. Our countries differ in history, resources, governance arrangement, and reform trajectories. But many of our concerns are shared in the region. Across the Southeast Asian region, education systems are working to recover learning, support teachers, strengthen institutions, harness technology responsibly, and respond to the demands of artificial intelligence that we all grapple with. These are not only education concerns, they are development concerns. The quality of education shapes social mobility, productivity, civic participation, and the capacity of societies to respond to change. Today's forum is therefore not only a venue for discussion, but a platform for evidence-based dialogue, shared learning, and regional cooperation. As we begin, may we be guided by a common purpose to strengthen education systems, expand opportunities for learners, and help transform them into the change makers of tomorrow. Again, thank you very much for being with us today, and we look forward to a thoughtful and productive exchange. Muli, magandang hapon sa ating lahat.
Join me in welcoming our President, President Angelo A. Jimenez of the University of the Philippines.
Maayong hapon sa atong tanan. Magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. I am very proud once again for the end time to be welcoming you as a host for this activity. But at any rate, I would like to thank our brand new center, the Center for Education and Development, together of course with SEAMEO INNOTECH and our partners from EDCOM too, which is where UP is very much embedded, for coming up with this very important activity today. And I have always said, let us continue talking about the learning crisis that we are experiencing today. And I have found is very common all over the world. In many parts of the world, they share the same particular crisis. Except that in some highly developed countries, it might be somewhat different. Some of them are lacking students because of fertility rates. Some of them are lacking students like the United States because of a high cost of education. The United States today has a 1.5 trillion student debt crisis. 10 years ago, around 51% of Americans think that higher education is good. Today, it has gone down to below 40%. And one of the primary reasons is the high cost of education. The education is just at that level that many Filipinos are coming over to the Philippines to study in Philippine universities because they can only afford community colleges in the United States. And every year they ask me to go to New York to do a road show, which I don't go. Well, I send a representative, sorry. So, but at any rate, this is the problem. And I'm particularly proud of the very brand new center that we have created at the University of the Philippines, and that is the Center for Education and Development, which is a brainchild of our global recruit, our current Vice President for Academic Affairs, Dr. Lorraine Sumaco, who is a proud product of the University of the Philippines. Are you a proud product? Sorry. Yeah. I assume she is proud of her university, and she's doing something. And this particular institution was born because of the EDCOM 2 report. And I have always said that before. I was one of those president whose assumption to office was greeted by the first EDCOM report. And it made for very grim reading. And subsequent reports were grimmer still. But there is hope because finally we have an evidence-based action plan. And this is what we are trying to promote today, to transform evidence into meaningful transformation. And I have said this of the Center for the University of the Philippines. Our task today is not just education and development. We frame it as a matter of national survival. No nation can long endure. No national project can long endure or can endure with the kind of crisis its educational system is experiencing as we are experiencing here today, as many parts of the world are experiencing today. I just came from the Education World Forum in London, and we heard voices from all over the world, and they're speaking about one thing, one beast that has entered the menagerie of beasts in the history of mankind. And this beast is, they call it artificial intelligence. But all are in agreement that the key is a foundational learning. The key to learning today is even before we have to face with AI, we have to talk about foundational literacy. And we're talking about literacy, which is the foundation for critical thinking, and numeracy, which is the foundation for scientific reasoning. And that we have to prepare learners today to be able to grasp this, have very strong foundation on literacy and numeracy before they can handle many other developments that is happening to humanity today, particularly the emergence of AI. But watch out, we're talking about AI today. That is just the current wave. There's another big wave coming, and that's quantum computing. And that will even be more challenging because it is more difficult to enter into. Can you imagine trying to manipulate matter in its smallest possible element that we still understand and recognize today? Subatomic particles. the limits of computing power, the limits of, are the limits of physics. And the limits of physics are the limits of computing power. I cannot imagine, don't trust me because I'm a lawyer, but I cannot imagine, I'm not trained for computing, quantum mechanics, but I just imagine what kind of world is being created today, and it is being created today. Just last week again, I visited Taiwan, and they showed me one of 5 major computer graphics chip manufacturing facility of TSMC. You see, when I first upgraded my iPhone a few years ago, iPhone 14, I have a 4 nanometer microchip embedded in it. It's very powerful. More power, I couldn't even fully utilize its capacity. Today, the brand new iPhone, it's 2 nanometers now. That's the kind of factory that they're producing it. 2 nanometers of microchips with billions and billions of microcircuits embedded into it, so invisible to the eye. It's impossible to manufacture by hand. There is one company that specializes in it. But let's not talk about it. Let's go back to education. But there's one thing though, for those in the Philippines, there's one very small development that I know and I feel and I believe has very far-reaching implication as far as the Philippines, as far as the role of the University of the Philippines is concerned in the country. Aside, of course, from creating our new university, University of Tacloban, and aside, of course, from introducing the College of Medicine in Mindanao, where the ratio of doctors is 1 for every 40,000, and the average in the Philippines is 1 for every 20,000 population, and the World Health Organization recommendation is 1 for every 1,000. It's this. There is a declaration in the Board of Regents that UP must focus on graduate school and research. And we have been working for this particular principle ever since I sat foot as the president of the University of the Philippines. The University of the Philippines was created as a tool of colonial policy, of American colonial policy, because they wanted to introduce a foreign concept on Asian soil, and they did try to produce a people, hopefully after their own image. And we have produced these graduates for over 118 years. We are 118 years this month. But we are no longer really able to address the aspirations of our people. Our most ardent ones, our deepest devotions. And so we're trying to reestablish this university anew, this time based on the strategic conditions operating in the environment today. And we are going to focus as a research and graduate school. We will cut our undergraduate population and focus instead on assisting all other universities in the country in attaining a high level of undergraduate education so that our graduate school will have a broader feeder base and we can now focus our contribution to Philippine society. Gone was 1908 where there were only 7 million Filipinos and 15 higher education institutions. Gone was a day when we were not yet formally independent. We will not get formally free. Today is the age of technology and we have to keep up with it. But more important than this is a time when we have to develop critical thinking of our population. And the University of the Philippines will respond to that in like manner. And so it is in this light that we're trying to propagate the results of EDCOM 2, which is very much also the University of the Philippines work. And I am very happy to be hosting this and as many activities like this as any one of you here would care to organize. Because I have to repeat this. This is not just a matter of responding to a learning crisis. This is not just a matter of responding to a learning crisis of regional and global scope. As far as the Philippines is concerned, as far as many nations in the world are concerned, the crisis in education is a crisis of national survival. And so this is how we frame the urgency and the seriousness of the matter that I know you will soon be discussing just in a few minutes starting. So, once again, thank you very much for coming over here and thank you also as well for those online. And I would like to thank once again SEAMEO INNOTECH, EDCOM 2, Karl Markey, of course, and of course one of our proudest graduate of the university, no less than the chair of the House Committee of Higher and Technical Education, Congressman Jude Asidre. And once again, to our brand new center, headed by our global recruit, Dr. Lorraine Sumaco, the current Vice President for Academic Affairs. Thank you very much. Daghang salamat. Mayang hapon utro.
Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming the Executive Director of EDCOM 2, Dr. Carol Marquis.
Maraming salamat. Magandang hapon po sa lahat. This is the first time that I'm going to speak on the EDCOM experience. So not the usual findings of the last 3-4 years, but instead a reflection on the process that we went through to come up with these findings. And so we thank SEAMEO and UP for the opportunity to reflect and to step back for a couple of steps while we are still rushing a few bills towards the end of this session. And to think about what we have learned in the last 3.5 years. Of course, I'll start by acknowledging the presence of our co-chair, Kong Jude Asidre. Hi, sir. Our hosts, Dr. Maha and also President Gigil, VP Lorraine of UP and SEAMEO, who have been really working with us and making sure that whatever we needed to find answers for, that we found answers in the last 3 years. And so we've always been seeking their help, SEAMEO and UP, to make sure that we are able to first benchmark whatever analysis we do versus the practices across ASEAN, but also that we're able to tap the very wide network of expertise of UP to make sure that no stone was unturned into the analysis that we have conducted. We'd also like to acknowledge the presence of Dr. Therese Bustos, our standing committee member in basic education, and also Dr. Dina Ocampo, for 2 years, a member also for standing committee on teacher education, and also our other partners in research who are here with us, UNICEF, working with us very closely as we move towards our 4th year of partnership, and also ID Insight. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank all policymakers listening to us, helping us, both national and local levels, teachers, and other movers of education policy reform in the country. Magandang hapon po. I'll start by, next slide, by saying that EDCOM was not a unique idea. In fact, in the Philippines, we have this habit of doing surveys and commissions to understand the problems of Philippine education. When I was starting my work in CEDEV a lifetime ago, one of the things that the then chair, Patricia Licuanan, told me was, Mark, education is already the most studied area. The reforms of the Philippines and what we need to do is very well documented already. And when I look back and study, mapping it from the 1925 to 2023, when the second Congressional Commission on Education first started, you have a total of 11 commissions and surveys that undertook an analysis of Philippine education, whether as a system as a whole or parts of it. Basic education only, TVET only, higher education only. In fact, when we released the last EDCOM report, the final report of EDCOM in January of this year, if you looked at it, sino po dito yung nakabasa na ng EDCOM final report? Naku, walang nakabasa. Please don't be shy. Please raise your hand. If you've downloaded the report, at least. Okay, very few also. We referenced a lot the 1925 Monroe Survey because in reality, it is the other bookend of a 100-year history of evolution of Philippine education as to where we started once the Americans came in and set up the initial structures of our public education system, and where are we now, 100 years after all of our aspirations, all of our laws, and all of the multiplied number of schools and access that has expanded since then. Next slide. When I was doing my PhD, I was able to find the copy of the Monroe Survey. And when I was reading through it, the discussion about the admin burdens of teachers were very rife. And to me, it dawned that 98 years after we first reported, next slide, according to the 1925 Monroe Survey, the first characteristic which impresses outside observers is the excessive number of written reports now required of all teachers and administrators in the Philippines. That no school system with which any of the members of the commission is acquainted requires so many. This was in 1925. In the final report of EDCOM in 2026, we report a total of 150 teacher forms required of public school teachers, reduced recently to 75. Still 75. And still needing to be rationalized because at least 4 of those are daily forms that teachers need to shade and submit. But when you start asking who owns this form, who uses the data that it then generates, who analyzes and then does something about it, then we start pointing fingers or asking questions. So not a lot of the things that we have found in the 100 years, which is why if you read the introduction that I wrote in the EDCOM report, the subtitle was A Century of Studies and Warnings, because we have been hearing most of the same. Not contrary to the experience of many education systems, as we massified access to basic education and then high school and then to secondary and then tertiary education, we were continuously grappling with limited resources, but continuous expansion, and then now naghahabol tayo when it comes to quality. Next slide. In the famous EDCOM report of the 1990s, the final report was Making Education Work, an agenda for reform. And in chapter 3, it says very explicitly, by the year 2000, this wish should be a reality, that more resources are channeled to basic education, that young people in underserved and depressed areas, as well as special learners, are given the first attention. The third, alternative learning strategies incorporated into alternative learning system, and the language used maximizes learning. Many controversial, many questionable aspirations aspired since then, not just in 1990, some 1925, some 1935, some UNESCO survey, some PESS survey of 1988, pero paulit-ulit. Which among these have we actually accomplished? When we were rattled by the PISA results of 2019 and we found that the Philippines was at the bottom of all participating countries, it jolted the legislature to once again set up the Second Congressional Commission on Education. That it was again not a time for piecemeal reform, but to look at it from a systems-level lens and for the legislature to act very seriously in working with the executive branch in understanding the problems of Philippine education and then to find transformative solutions, because the buck stops here. Things need to change because our students are really not learning. Little did we realize that we were only scratching the tip of the iceberg. That as we kept digging for the last 3.5 years, now nearing 4th, we are uncovering in greater and greater detail, one, how bad or how severe learning has happened, and second, what are the factors or the root causes that have led to this crisis that we are facing. That, to be fair to Congress and to the Senate, in the early 2000s, not a lot were willing to admit that we had a crisis. Next slide. In the last 3 years of EDCOM, in our first iteration, when we were not yet enhanced, we published 3 reports. The first was Miseducation, the failed system for Philippine education, which was quite criticized, controversial, na para namang wala tayong ginawa. May ginawa tayo, pero natuto ba lahat ng bata at bakit ba hindi natututo? That was really the main question that we wanted to ask. In the second year, we published Fixing the Foundations, that we found that the roots of it was very early on, from 0 to 8 years old, which continues to be the most underinvested area of education today in our country. And finally, Turning Point, which is the final report of EDCOM, synthesizing all of our findings in the last 3 years, but also putting forward a proactive roadmap for reform for the next 10 years. Because let us admit it, there is no way to solve all of these problems overnight. Even if everyone is superhuman in DepEd, in our schools, we cannot solve accumulated challenges very quickly with just magic. We need to work hard, we need to build capacity, we need to improve coordination across agencies, we need to fund, we all need to do our part. Next slide. But to be very honest to everyone, in the last 3 years of our work, we have been asking ourselves internally, or at least me, I was asking this, but some have also posed this question to me. Is the existence of a commission such as EDCOM or commissions, as in the past 100 years of Philippine education, symptomatic of a deeper problem, that there is an absence of institutionalized mechanisms to regularly assess and correct the course of our education system. In the second month of Secretary Angara, when he took on the role of DepEd Secretary, I joined him for a visit to Singapore, and we sat down with the Minister of the Singapore Ministry of Education. And they told us that here in Singapore, we don't try to do one-time, big-time revolutionary reforms. We do evolution because you need to keep innovating, refining, improving, and that every year that needs to happen and be seen through. Or, on the contrary, maybe, given our local context, given our temperaments and political cycles and governance, that it is a necessary piece of the puzzle, at least for the Philippine education, to function effectively, to function efficiently, so that there is actual coordination, that maybe there needs to be this third body or this other body that plays this role. We still don't know the answer to this question, or maybe we don't all have the same answers to these questions, but this is something that we have been reflecting on also in relation to our process. Next slide. EDCOM 2 was deliberately designed by our legislators to mirror the systemic ambition of EDCOM 1, which was to conduct a very intensive analysis of what our problems were, using available data and using extensive consultations on the ground. That we were not going to be confined in the halls of the House of Representatives or of the Senate, but we will go to schools, talk to teachers, talk to parents, talk to students. And that was the model that the second EDCOM followed. There were 4 components that I think were the main features of EDCOM. First, that it was a legislative engine for reform with close coordination of both houses of Congress and jointly leading the reform discussions of EDCOM. Second, that it set up a technical secretariat that had expertise, or at least were focused on the different subsectors of education in the country. Third, which is actually quite new, to put together an advisory council, later expanded to a standing committee, to make sure it is not just an echo chamber of government people, an echo chamber of legislators, but instead one that is expansive in its perspectives because it opened the doors of legislature to academic experts, to industry, to former government employees, etc. The fourth aspect, which I think was quite critical, and the wisdom of the legislators in putting into the law of the second EDCOM, was access to data. It gave EDCOM the subpoena power to get data because we knew, after 30 years of our history in this new system after EDCOM 1, that some data is withheld, that not all data is shared or shared very partially. And then finally, that you need to do the reforms while you are studying it. The first EDCOM po kasi did the studies and then terminated and then legislated. The model of the second EDCOM was, as we are finalizing studies, when there are already insights, you also do the legislative work alongside it. Next slide. So far, we have had a roster of education leaders joining EDCOM. Thankfully for us, nagbabago-bago ng roles pero same people, more or less, in the last 3 years. And we have been extremely fortunate that after their deep dive or immersion in EDCOM for the first year and a half, Secretary Angara, who was then Senator, and Congressman Benitez, who was then with the House, moved on to implement the reforms in the executive branch. This was serendipitous, or a good turnout for the second EDCOM that was not the same case for the first EDCOM. In the first EDCOM in the 1990s, there was resistance from the executive branch in implementing the reforms pushed by the legislative branch. But this time, there is greater convergence because the thinking is of the same mind, because we were using the same references, same studies, same data, same visits to push for the reforms. Next slide. We tried to map out that since 2023, these are the changes in leadership or in commissioners of EDCOM. But also, unintentionally, we have been lucky about several things. One is that the House leadership has remained stable and very active in the discussions. And then from the Senate side, for some reason, there was an idea at a certain point to one, ensure that there is always a member of the minority in the Senate composition, and second, that the chair of finance is always also a member of EDCOM, which is why initially Secretary Angara was chair of Finance Committee, which is why most of the reforms that needed resourcing were funded in the first year of EDCOM, and then in the second, third year, it was Senator Win who took over of the Senate Committee on Finance, kaya marami ring reforma na pondohan. And so I think these are learnings that were incidental to our work in the last 3 years. Next slide. This is the advisory council, at least some of them. So a good mixture of experts with experience on the ground, themselves as teachers, principals, but also researchers, nutritionists, etc., etc. Next slide. Because of the work of both houses working very closely in the last 3 years, there was also a relationship built among the legislators themselves, but even among the staff. And therefore, coordination became much easier as we went along. We learned each other's rhythms, we learned how to best talk to each other, we learned how to make sure that before things are passed, most of the concerns are ironed out in a productive fashion, which is why in the 19th Congress, there were 11 laws passed just within the first 2 years of EDCOM. Next slide. In the third year of EDCOM, nagkaroon na ng priority legislation. Before we started the work in EDCOM, there was not a single measure that was in the LEDAC list of priorities in education. And Sec RC himself pointed that out. That how come there is no education here? Because when we gave him the EDCOM report the first year, sabi niya, there are so many problems, why is it not a priority here in the LEDAC list? Which is why as another champion of EDCOM, they work closely with our legislature to ensure that in the 20th Congress, there are 7 bills that are priority, 2 of which will already await the President's signature in a few weeks. Another 2 also finalizing today and tomorrow, hopefully, crossing our fingers. And then 3 also in mature stages of deliberation. These are just among another slew of legislative work that are structural in nature, among them updating the charter of TESDA and CEDEV, untouched since 1994, and also updating the mandate of CEDEV as it relates to state universities and colleges, and for the first time, a bill on the governance of LUCs. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, the wisdom of legislature to put in as a BINA provision was quite critical because at least 2 things it allowed us to do. It allowed us, or at least some of us, to truly analyze the quality of the licensure examination for teachers and the questionnaires that they contain, which has been in the safety deposit box of someone for the last 30 years since 1994, and then the National Achievement Test. Next slide. I'm not sure if any of you, or if all of you, have followed how DepEd would report the National Achievement Test. Ako po, we would look at the studies. And in previous years, prior to 2023, it was always reported as mean percentage score. Mean percentage score in NAT grade 6 was 46.64, of NAT grade 10, 42.4, and NAT grade 12, 40.61. So it tells you maybe there is a problem. It signals that yes, there is a problem, but how bad is the problem and how many of our students are actually proficient, we actually did not have a vision of. It was not very clear. Which is why when finally we requested, appealed, begged, but also pushed the release of the National Achievement Test data itself, including the questionnaires, we were able to do an analysis. And this is what then it becomes. Because by using the same data set, you can actually generate more insightful information that tells us where we are as a country. That apparently in grade 6, what was reported as a 46.64 mean percentage score meant that only 19% of students were actually proficient or highly proficient. And that what 40.61 at grade 12 was actually a 0.4% proficiency rate among our grade 12 students. This is why, at least for us, there needs to be a continued call for release or transparency of information so that it can be analyzed even if not by the entire public, at least by scholars who can really scrutinize and draw insight so that it informs policy and it informs intervention well. Because unless we diagnose well, how can we actually solve things with the resolve it requires? Next slide. I would like to quote actually Kong Isidre in his writing in our EDCOM report. At least the disposition that was followed by EDCOM in the last 3.5 years, that to the extent possible, our legislators, our commissioners agreed from the get-go that any bill that it will put forward would have to go through in-depth analysis and be informed by ground-level consultations with actual stakeholders. That it will not be just a hearing in Congress or in the Senate, that to the extent possible, we will have studies commissioned, we will look at all of the data that is available, and we will speak to the stakeholders that will actually be affected by these. A legislature or a Congress that listens before it legislates, that learns before it leads, and acts only after understanding the depth and complexity of the problems at hand. And what were these problems that we only actually begun to understood after our consultations? So many of these new insights we came about only by October or November of 2023, well within the first year of EDCOM. Next slide. So these were the three things we were looking for in our 3 years of work. What are the local challenges? What is our baseline information? Second, where are our positive deviants? Okay. And then third, what are global best practices? Next slide. In the course of our work, we did 32 hearings, 53 workshops, 10 site visits, and 3 benchmarking missions. Next slide. We need to speed up. But also work with partners such as UP, PIDS, ID Insight, UNICEF to publish 103 studies, all of which you could download in the EDCOM website. Among our findings, and quick fire na lang, next slide, that apparently in 10 years, although nuancing that some of the years hindi naman talaga textbooks yung intended, you only had grades 5 and 6 having complete textbooks from 2012 to 2023. Next slide, that apparently half of our schools did not have principals since 1997. Next slide, that there were years such as 2018 when construction was only 11 classrooms out of the universe of backlog that we were facing. Next slide. Ito po, kinompute namin on the spot while we were having the hearing, getting the data from the Bureau of Learner Support Services to add it up because it used to be in a printed piece of paper that did not have an analysis. That apparently since 2013, when we passed the Anti-Bullying Act of 2013, the reported cases surged to 20,000. Next slide. And because we had the ability to get data from both CEDEV and DepEd, when we juxtapose the data on guidance counselor vacancies of DepEd versus which universities actually offered a master's in guidance counseling, yun pala, may mga regions, no one offered a master's in guidance counseling. How will you fill up vacancies of guidance counselors when there is not a single university offering that master's program? Next slide. These are 3 things that I think supported the work of EDCOM. First, field offices, teachers, and principals did not see EDCOM as DepEd, and because they didn't know us, I think there was more willingness to share what their actual experience was without fearing consequences. And so we actually was able to hear more from them about their experience. Interagency conversations were easier because they did not feel we were turfing, because we were just convening or facilitating the discussions. And third, that the data was now systems level. It was not just DepEd data, it was DepEd data connected to TESDA and CHED data. Next slide. And so we say that after 3.5 years, now that we are in the enhanced version for 2 years, malayo pa pero malayo na, that we clearly understand now what the problems are, that we know exactly what needs to be done and what is the most urgent, and that we need to take advantage of this unprecedented alignment between the executive and the legislative branch, which is a truly, truly unique window in our history. Next slide. But I share the same question as many of you. The joke always is, do we need an EDCOM 3? Will we need an EDCOM 3 10 years from now, 20 years from now? How do we sustain reforms beyond 2028? And how do we ensure continuity despite changes? of political leaders, priorities, and personalities. And these are the same questions I think that some of you share. Next slide. Just want to put forward that we feel strongly that reform requires stability and institutional memory. Because without that, if everyone starts from zero at every administration, at every new secretary, then how will we actually build things up? Lagi po tayo nasa first floor bungalow. Kailangan po makaakyat. Next slide. And so I will leave and end this discussion with just 3 questions. Where can and should institutional memory reside? Should it be in the executive, the legislative branch, civil society, universities, or all? Second, how do we create a critical mass of champions? And who should these champions be? Obviously, legislators play a huge role, but beyond government, who else? And how can they be organized and supported? And third, how do we lock in transparency and accountability so that moving forward, whether or not there is an EDCOM, there is rigorous research that could be done because data is available, and if universities like UP play its role of really understanding and continuing its concern for Philippine education, then it can continue doing the analysis or even go deeper with the availability and access to data so that we can make sure that moving forward, we will not be stunned again by an international assessment because we know ourselves where we are and how we are growing each year. Maraming salamat po.
Ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome a proud member of the House of Representatives, the Honorable Jude Asidre.
Magandang hapon po sa lahat. I was actually rewriting my notes while listening to the discussion, so I had to print it again. So I'd like to start by thanking all of you for taking part in this important forum, Education for Development, Conversations on the EDCOM 2 reports. When we filed the bill last year lang, no? For the extension of EDCOM, we were asking ourselves, so what do we do with the extra 2 years? And honestly, this is how I really imagine it to be. For the last 3 years, we were the ones talking, making the policy, discussing, and I hope the next 2 years we will spend listening to the experiences of our stakeholders as they try to implement the results of the EDCOM 2. I always say that the time of crisis is always a time of opportunity. Where we face challenges, we always see possibilities. That is why I think the title of this forum asks a question that is both simple yet profound: education for development. It invites us to ask whether our educational system is truly preparing Filipino learners for life, for work, for citizenship, and nation building. It asks whether education is helping families rise from poverty, helping communities grow, helping industries become more productive, and helping the country build a future that is more inclusive, competitive, and humane. Through the second Congressional Commission on Education, we have been given a clearer picture of our education landscapes. The reports have shown us the learning gaps, the governance weaknesses, the struggles of teachers, the fragmentation of the system, the urgent need to connect education with workforce development, social mobility, and of course, national progress. But EDCOM 2 also gives us hope. It shows us that reform is possible when we listen carefully, study the evidence, coordinate across institutions, and commit to long-term action. It reminds us that education must never be treated only as a sectoral concern. It is a development concern. It's a poverty concern. It's an employment concern. It's a governance concern. And in the words of my favorite president of UP, it's a national survival concern. So as I close this afternoon's conversation, I believe that the path forward must be guided by 3 values: co-responsibility, collaboration, and community. First, co-responsibility. Co-responsibility reminds us that education is not only the duty of government alone, or teachers alone, or parents alone. Every child's learning is national concern. When a child enters school hungry, that is also a nutrition issue, a health issue, a poverty issue, and a local governance issue. When a learner reaches grade 4 without being able to read well, That is a signal that early childhood care, family support, curriculum, assessment, remediation, and school readiness must work together. It's exactly what you've been saying earlier. When a college student leaves school because of financial difficulty, that is a question of access, social protection, student support, and national investment. If education is truly for development, then education outcomes must become shared development outcomes. Our first policy direction, therefore, is to institutionalize education as a whole of government and a whole of society responsibility. This means stronger coordination among DepEd, CHED, and other national government agencies, our local government units, and other relevant agencies. But it should go beyond mere structural coordination. It means, foremost, creating shared accountability for outcomes, such as school readiness, reading by grade 3, learner retention, teacher support, skills development, employability, and lifelong learning. This should be monitored through a common national framework with clear roles, measurable targets, and regular reporting to Congress and the public. We must also prioritize the foundations of learning. I've been listening to the conversation, and a good part of it focused on really caring for early childhood development. The first 100 days, first 1,000 days, early childhood and development, kindergarten to grade 3, reading and numeracy, timely textbooks, early assessment, and structured remediation. Development begins with a child, and the child's future begins long before graduation day. Second, collaboration. Collaboration reminds us we cannot reform education through silos. This has been our biggest frustration. Basic education, higher education, technical vocational training, workforce development, and lifelong learning must be connected. A learner's journey is continuous. A child in early education becomes a basic education learner. A basic education learner later chooses a pathway through senior high school, college, technical vocational training, employment, entrepreneurship, or further training. A worker will have to reskill and upskill throughout life. The problem is our institutions often approach these stages as separate parts of a system when they should be treated as one continuous pathway for the learner. That's why the trifocalized educational system must become more connected in practice. And I think Carol is doing a good job trying to make that happen. DepEd, CHED, and TESDA must work not merely side by side, but together. Their plans, data systems, qualification standards, and targets must speak to each other. The second policy direction is to support the full implementation of the National Education Workforce Plan, Development Plan for 2026 to 2035 as the country's 10-year roadmap for reform. The plan must guide legislation, budgeting, oversight, and agency performance. Carol forced me to read the entire plan because he asked me to write the introduction to that. I realized the National Education Workforce and Development Plan must also become a living and lived document. It must live in national policy, in agency plans, in congressional oversight, in budget decisions, and most importantly, in local action. We must understand how this roadmap can be refined, translated, and owned at the local level, because education reforms only becomes truly meaningful when communities see themselves in it. We must avoid this tendency to treat plans superficially. Filipinos are very good with plans. One of my most frustrating experience, even before I was a congressman, was really working with the localization of Ambition 2040. I have more regional experience in development work. It was a strong vision for the country. But since we were able to develop it, it did not take enough root to across institutions, local government, communities, and implementation systems, because it was not fully embedded in institutions, fully mainstreamed to other agency plans, translated into funded projects, and consistently carried by implementing agencies. What happened is that the promise of the plan gave way to fragmented action and even priorities, and at times policy incoherence across the system. That's why I've been suggesting to ED Carroll, and the rest of the Commission, for the National Education Workforce Development Plan to succeed, it must be accompanied by a National Education Investment Plan that identifies priorities, funding requirements, institutional responsibilities, timelines, and measurable outcomes. A roadmap without an investment remains an aspiration. A roadmap with investment becomes a real instrument for reform. If education is for development, then classrooms must connect with communities, campuses must connect with industries, and learning must connect with opportunity. This means stronger education employment pathways, work-based learning, apprenticeship, internship, industry partnership, micro-credentials, recognition of prior learning, flexible learning, lifelong upskilling. That's why I just want to share with you yesterday, we approved at the bicameral level the universal access to quality tertiary education, the amended version. It shows that the reform is moving from diagnosis to legislative action. Universal access must mean more than opening the doors of college. It must also mean helping poor and deserving students stay, finish, and succeed. Access without completion leaves many learners behind. Access with proper support, targeted subsidies, student services, and sustainable financing gives our young people a real chance to complete their studies and build better lives for themselves and their families. Congress can support this through laws and budget that reward coordination, measurable outcomes, regional relevance, and industry participation. Oversight must not only ask what each agency did separately, but what they achieved together for learners and for national development. This is the same spirit behind several legislative measures that we have championed in Congress that we will file next week on June 10. It's a set of new laws that somewhat tries to bring in innovation, at least in the higher education landscape. We have a proposed Education to Employment Act. It strengthens pathways from learning to work. We have the Philippine Higher Education Institutionalization Act, Internationalization Act, that can help our universities participate more actively in global academic networks. We are pushing for a Philippine Higher Education Faculty and Development and Research Act that will strengthen our academy to teach, mentor, discover, and innovate. We're pushing for an Abot Kayang Pangarap Act that would strengthen ladderized and modular learning pathways, allowing learners to earn credentials progressively, move more flexibly across programs, and continue the education even when life, work, or financial circumstances require them to pause and return. We're working on, and we will file next week, a tripartite council act that will institutionalize stronger coordination between government, education institutions, industry, and labor. And we are, of course, pushing for the Foreign Academic Faculty Tenure Act that would provide academic tenure for foreign professors, foreign academe, and bring global expertise into our classrooms, laboratories, and research communities. These reforms matter because innovation does not happen by accident. It requires people, institutions, partnerships, and policies that make new ideas possible. That's why we've been pushing together with ED Carroll the creation of an education reform caucus in Congress, a permanent space where legislators can sustain the work of EDCOM 2, align legislative priorities, monitor implementation, and keep education reform alive beyond committee hearings and political cycles. Collaboration also requires better data. We need interoperable education data systems that allow us to track learner progression, identify dropouts early, support struggling learners, measure outcomes, and connect education planning with labor market needs. I've always reminded EDCOM 2, they always tell me, sir, what you don't measure, you cannot improve. So good data allows us to see the learner clearly. Good coordination allows us to serve the learner better. Lastly, community. Community reminds us that every national plan becomes real only when it reaches the barangay, the classroom, the home, the campus, the workshop, the family, the workplace. Education reform succeeds when communities understand it, shape it, own it, and sustain it. A national policy can set direction, but its true test is always local implementation. The best reform plan must make sense to a teacher in a multi-grade classroom, a parent in a coastal barangay, a student in a state university, a trainer in a TESDA center, an employer in a growing industry, and a local government trying to respond to the needs of its people. So the third policy direction is to strengthen local education governance and community-based reform. Local school board, local universities and colleges, barangay councils, PTAs, civil society groups, all of these community organizations must have clearer roles in supporting learning outcomes. Every locality should be encouraged to develop its own education and workforce development agenda aligned with the national roadmap. This includes local literacy campaign, nutrition support, dropout prevention, and many other learning support activities. Education for development must mean education that reaches real people in real places. It means learning that strengthens family, empowers communities, supports livelihood, and builds the nation from the ground up. So from those three values, allow me to summarize the key policy recommendations I've learned listening to all of you, my homework, when I get back to Congress tomorrow. First is to make sure that we work on institutionalizing whole of government and whole of society accountability for education outcomes, especially in ECCD, foundational learning, learning retention, and workforce readiness. Second, we must make the National Education and Workforce Development Plan a living document by translating it into local action plans, mainstreaming it to agency plans, aligning it with clear investment plan, and using it as a long-term roadmap for legislation, budgeting, implementation, and oversight. Third, we have to strengthen coordination among the different education agencies, LGUs, industry, labor, and other stakeholders through common targets, shared data, joint planning, and of course, congressional oversight. Fourth, we have to prioritize foundational learning to the first 1,000 days, ECCD, kindergarten to grade 3, reading by grade 3, early numeracy, timely learning materials, and early remediation. Fifth, we have to build stronger education to employment pathways through work-based learning. Sixth, we have to empower communities at LG to localize education reforms through their own innovation partnerships and engagements. Six is to advance a coherent legislative reform agenda that connects across different sectors of learning. And eighth, and most importantly, to establish permanent habits of reform in Congress through regular oversight of F22 recommendations, sustained monitoring of the 10-year roadmap, evidence-based budgeting, and an education reform caucus that keeps these issues alive beyond political cycles. In the end, education reform, for me, is a test of national will. We already have the evidence. We now have a clear diagnosis. We are already beginning to build a roadmap. What we need is the discipline to follow through. I remember, just a quick story, I was invited to a forum. I was asked during the forum, Congressman, how would you rate Philippine education? Parang ang tanong pa, parang beauty contest. Sabi niya, from a scale of 1 to 10, sir, how would you rate the state of Philippine education at the moment? And I said, I'll give it a 6 or a 7. And he said, but sir, you've been just speaking for the last hour, telling all of this problem from the lack of classrooms, to learning poverty, and all these things. I said, you still give it a 7. I said, yes. Why is it a 7, sir? And I said, because whenever I see a teacher who works hard every day to give her best so that her students will learn despite the difficulties that she had to deal with. Whenever I realized when we went to Cavite, there are kids who go to school as early as 5 a.m., grade 1, grade 2, and still try to show up every day. And then you have parents who try to make both ends meet so that their kids can finish their schooling. I think we have more than enough to start with. I think we're not all shadows. There's a lot of silver lining in the way our educational system is, because in the end, it's really what we have in us that would shape the future of the society that we become. And I hope this forum reminds us that the future of Philippine education will be built on 3 things: co-responsibility, collaboration, and community. Co-responsibility because every child is our shared concern. Collaboration because every part of the system must work together. Community because every reform must reach real people in real places. And so the question, education for development, must become more than the title of a forum. It must be a national commitment. Education for development means every child learns early and learns well. Education for development means every teacher is supported. Education for development means every learner has a pathway. Education for development means every community becomes part of the solution. Education for development means every law, budget, program, and reform must answer one question. Will this help Filipino learners live better, work better, serve better, and build a better country? So before I close, allow me to express my sincere appreciation to the organizers of this important conversation, the University of the Philippines, SEAMEO INNOTECH, Professor Maha, of course, Pres Gigil, for creating this space for thoughtful, evidence-based, and nation-building dialogue on Philippine education. I'd like to thank also the panelists for sharing your ideas. I actually learned a lot from you. I'd like to thank EDCOM too for its continuing work in bringing clarity, urgency, and direction to the reform agenda, and for everyone for sharing your insights, experience, and commitment to the future of Filipino learners. So the challenge before us is clear. Let us turn EDCOM 2 from a commission of findings to a movement for reform. Let us turn reports into action, action to results, and results into better futures for our learners and for our nation. That work begins now, and it belongs to all of us. With courage, with determination, shared purpose, we can build an education system that gives every Filipino child the chance to learn fully, grow freely, and live with dignity, opportunity, and hope. Maraming salamat po.